Hey, gang, this week's episode is brought to you by Royal Retros, the king of throwbacks. Hey, if you're looking for teams and leagues that don't exist anymore, but you'd like to remember them in high-quality jersey or uniform format, hey, some of those teams were legendary. Some of them were disasters, but they all live at Royal Retros. Check them out. RoyalRetros.com. Use that promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Check them out now. And now, check out this episode.
The ABA was like a fraternity, and almost like a secret fraternity. Both ridiculous and sublime. And it was underrated. We knew that the larger basketball world did not fully appreciate how good this was.
They were slam dunking the three-point shot. That was all the ABA.
Today's NBA game is 100% an iteration of what the ABA players started in 1967.
You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. You know, players who got screwed, and I don't think that is a wrong that'll ever be righted.
It's like you cheated people out of their money. I mean, how else can you say it?
He's just the beginning. ABA players lying under bridges, sleeping, homeless.
Most of the players at the time were showing me redacted pages what exactly happened in 1976 when the two leagues combined.
We're finding out things that we weren't even aware of.
It was really a biblical story of David versus Goliath. I mean, we were three guys that took on the billion-dollar NBA industry.
There are these former players out there who set the table at which you have people today making $30 and $40 million a year. What are we going to do for them? Because this is bigger than basketball. What are you going to do?
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, let's get to it. How are you, everybody? It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I hope you are doing well, all things being equal. And I am honored to have your presence this week, as I do every week. Thank you for finding us in your podcast feeds and downloading us and putting us in your earbuds. We appreciate that. This week, a really impactful film that I want you to know about, in particular with the guy who put it together. As you heard in that little preview there, it is the story of the ABA, and it's not the story that you think you know. The film is called The Waiting Game, and the subtitle, They Changed Basketball, When Will They Be Given Their Due? It is written and directed and co-produced by a guy named Michael Husain, who's our guest this week. And if you think you know everything about the ABA and its melding, for lack of a better word, with the NBA back in 1976, some call it a merger, others called it an expansion. As we get into our conversation and this film, you will understand that those two words have a very strong and potent meanings, and legally mean different things. And that is the crux of the fine print, shall we say, about this story, which is largely around the guys who have not been fully given their due. Some have, as we'll talk in our conversation, and as this movie plays out, which I highly encourage you to watch. I'll tell you how to find it in a minute. But also those who are still not fully made whole from their years in the ABA, as the NBA has for many years dragged its feet and then some to make the ABA players part of a pension program and retirement and benefits, frankly, that many believe they are due by virtue of their amalgamation into the NBA. And we're going to get into the various twists and turns of that story. The Dropping Dimes Foundation, which you may remember from our great conversation with Bob Nedelicki, great ABA pro, and the late Robin Miller, who helped Neto put his book together. I think it was one of our earlier episodes. I think it was episode 45 or 46, something like that. But the Dropping Dimes Foundation, which is plays a crucial role in this story and in this movie, has been around for about a decade now and has been specifically focused on trying to raise funds and also, frankly, generate more awareness of the plight of a literally dying breed of player, not many of them left, who were stars in their own right of the ABA, some of whom made a successful transition into the NBA, many others who did not, and a lifetime and then some of expectation that they would be, in some respects, if not taken care of, at least financially buttressed by a pension plan that the ABA players believed and legally thought that they were entitled to as part of that combination in 1976. That is a simplification of the story. The film is a tremendous watch. It is called The Waiting Game, and we're going to be talking about it with its writer, its director, and producer, Michael Husain, in a couple of minutes. And you will enjoy the conversation. Once you're done with it, you need to run, not walk, to get a copy of this film. How can you get this film? Well, it is currently on the documentary circuit with events and that kind of stuff. In particular, coming to Louisville, an ABA city of yore, on March 6th. They'll be at the train station there, which is sort of conjoined there with the AAA Louisville baseball stadium there. And it's going to be a big event on the 6th of March. We're going to talk. They're going to have folks talking about the film. Some ABA players will be there, and of course, a screening of this film called The Waiting Game. It is not available in streaming yet. However, you can go to this website, thewaitinggamemovie.com, thewaitinggamemovie.com, and you can watch the film for, I think, $10, which is a drop in the bucket, so to speak. I think some of the money goes to paying some of the costs of creating the film and maybe a little bit to the Dropping Dimes Foundation. So you can watch it there. And as we'll hear in our conversation, we're going to do our best to help promote this film further so it gets wider distribution, including hopefully streaming someday somewhere near you. So again, thewaitinggamemovie.com. You can check out more about the film and watch it as well. And we encourage you to do so. But first, please sit back and enjoy this tremendous conversation with Michael Husain and me as we talk about the origin story of this Waiting Game documentary film, and of course, the bigger stories behind it. This 1976, don't call it a merger, maybe call it an expansion, amalgam, if you will, of the NBA and the ABA that kind of generated the situation that has since played out. And of course, it's also a reminiscence of the ABA, the American Basketball Association, which is near and dear to our hearts. We've had many previous conversations, but this is an important part of the story. And we're happy to present it to you in its entirety right now. Thank you for listening, and here we go. This show, as probably evidenced in my emails and stuff, kind of started out really almost as just a curiosity play. Growing up in the 70s, big soccer fan, outdoor soccer and ASL, that kind of stuff, but very familiar with things like the NBA, the ABA and the WHA, and for a hot minute, the WFL, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of just more curiosity and, I don't know, whimsy, I guess, crazy stories, wacky this and that, and here today, gone tomorrow, and whatever happened
Yes.
to, and all the. But as we've, unearthed and gotten deeper into various stories, especially with folks who are or were direct participants in these things, it wasn't all fun and games. That's why I was really excited to talk to you and know about the existence of this film, because we have nibbled around the edges of this story of the ABA with folks like Pat Boone and Dennis Murphy, rest in peace, and
Sure.
and Bob Nedelecki with Robin Miller talking about the original sort of our understanding of dropping dimes. But I am shocked that it took so long for a film like this to come out into the world. And I appreciate you taking time to have a conversation about it. Before we go any further, tell me and our audience how this story hits your radar, and what's the day job give us the adjunct story before we go any further.
Well, I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I'm a storyteller, and that's what I love doing. And I live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and you mentioned the Dropping Dimes Foundation, which was set up very specifically to help ABA players, former ABA players, who were struggling in their later years. And there's a lot of backstory to that as to why they were struggling. But they were definitely some guys who, could not afford rent. They're being evicted. They were couldn't afford life-saving medicines, insulin, that sort of thing. Scary stuff for anybody, but especially when you're in your 70s or 80s. And then also when you were once one of the elite athletes in the world, and ABA guys were that. And so Dropping Dimes formed to help them. I meet one of the two co-founders. It was founded by two guys, Dr. John Abrams, who actually is the Indiana Pacers eye doctor, has been for 30 plus years, and was a ball boy for the Pacers when they were in the ABA.
And an interesting irony that comes out in the film a little later on, but we'll get to that.
Yeah. And then Scott Tarter, who is an attorney here in town. And I met Scott by chance, really. And he started telling me, he seemed like a nice guy, and he started telling me what he was doing, and that he had been negotiating with the NBA to help ABA players for well over a year at that point. And he thought that they were really close. He thought they were 5 to 6 weeks away, and it was going to be announced at the All-Star game in February of 2022. And, storyteller me says, well, that's a great story. That's a feel good. And so I asked him if we could follow him for those 4 or 5, 6 weeks, because you can't recreate that moment when something like that breaks. He agreed, and I thought it was a short film. I thought it was maybe a 10-minute film. And February comes and goes and no announcement. And Scott, gets back with the NBA. They say, sorry, it's just really technicality. It's going to be 3 weeks, a month tops. And that time frame comes and goes. Nothing happens. And as you can imagine, he'd gotten to know a lot of these guys pretty well, just because he was helping them all the time. Dropping Dimes was helping them all the time. And so he was getting frustrated from that perspective. And then some of them started getting, and some of them started dying. The more delay at that age, you just don't know what's going to happen, and some bad stuff started to happen. So what started off as a feel good started to get a little dicey, and it became a much larger film.
Yeah, if there's any hero in this movie, I think there are a bunch of smaller heroes in this, but it's probably Scott Tarter. Maybe a little understanding of his adjunct to the story as well, because I think without his indefatigable stick-to-itiveness, I guess.
Yes.
This probably wouldn't have gone to its, well, I wouldn't call it full conclusion. But there's a little bit of still a cliffhanger a bit, but a substantial resolution that just seems to take forever as this film, not in a bad way, but to your point, many missed deadlines, so to speak, or expectations. And he's kind of the guy kind of being probably beaten over the head by all of them all along the way.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so he grew up. So you got John Abrams's backstory a little bit earlier. Scott Tarter's backstory was he grew up very working class on the east side of Indianapolis. His father worked at a Ford plant. He was a factory worker, and you know, and what you come to learn is that these ABA players are analogous to factory workers. They built what a lot of what you would consider the modern NBA, the three-point shot, the athletic, fast style of play, entertainment, player fashion, halftime shows, you know, all the stuff that's cool and fun about the ABA or about the NBA kind of came from the ABA. And so Scott just grew up loving that stuff and wound up putting himself through law school and becoming a lawyer. And you know, these heroes of his when he was a child. I mean, he used to play basketball in a church parking lot and pretend that he was the ABA stars, like so many of us did that sort of thing. So he's very earnest about his love for the ABA and how it kind of reminds him of his dad, and so he took this very personally. It was a pro bono legal job. So he was never paid anything. He was just really devoted to kind of getting what he felt was justice for these ABA guys.
And it is, I think there's a sub-hero of this too, almost part and parcel of this. So this is actually probably sort of how I also found out about sort of the bigger story about this too, was Dana Hunsinger, Banbo, right? Who, the Indianapolis Star, who I think, frankly, is arguably the only person that's ever kind of really been on this beat, so to speak. It's almost been kind of her unearthing and her kind of diligence digging up stuff along the way.
She's a fabulous sports writer, and you know, the Indianapolis Star is a sort of maybe surprisingly they do some excellent investigative work. If you have seen the documentary Athlete A, that you know, they worked to uncover the Larry Nassar gymnastics abuse story, and so Dana's on, you know, she's a sports writer on that team, and she came across the story really many years ago. Dropping Dimes was formed either 2014 or 15. And one of the first things they did to try and help guys, I mean, they didn't have much money, whatever Scott and John put in of their own cash. So, you know, they had a few $1,000. And one of the first people they tried to help was a former pacer named Charlie Jordan. And Charlie was struggling. He had dementia, and but he wanted to look nice to go to church. So all he wanted was enough money to get a new suit to go to church. And there's a lot of poignance in that. And so Dropping Dimes took him to a big and tall shop here in Indianapolis, and some former Pacer teammates came to help as well. And they fitted him for a couple of new suits, and he looked great. And Dana covered that story, and it really touched her. And one of the former Pacers who was there that day is a guy named Mel Daniels, who, if you're an ABA basketball fan, you would recognize that name. But he was, you know, an excellent basketball player. But he stayed involved in the game after he retired. So he became a scout for the Indiana Pacers, who are now in the NBA, and even an assistant coach. And as they traveled around the country, Mel kept meeting his former ABA brothers, as he would call them, and seeing a lot of them struggling. And so he was, you know, banging the drum like, hey, why isn't anybody doing anything? Tried to get somebody to pay attention. He got Scott Tarter and John Abrams aware enough so that they started a not-for-profit. And he got Dana aware enough to say, look, Charlie Jordan is just the tip of the iceberg. You need to know about more of these guys. And so she followed the story, what she thought was going to be an afternoon story about a guy getting fitted for a suit. She wound up following it for 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, and you also have some footage of the 50th reunion, 50th anniversary of the ABA, from, I want to, when was that? That was probably 2018, maybe?
Exactly.
Okay. So we started this show about 2017. So we had some inkling about that with some of our previous ABA guests and stuff. But in some respects, that's actually a very fitting locus, I guess, for a lot of the story, because it kind of encompasses sort of both sides of this. Number one is some of the specifics that we'll maybe get a little more granular about in a couple of minutes, about the players not getting any kind of compensation or support after years of expectation of such. But almost prior to that, though, is almost sort of a celebration, if you will, of a league that, as you hinted at, but maybe we could talk about for a couple of minutes here, was instrumental in a lot of different ways in terms of its contributions, its shift of the pro game, its legacies, sometimes begrudgingly admitted, other times, frankly, just completely forgotten, yet through the prism of history and remembrances and, frankly, cycles of style and those kinds of things as they come and go, almost an overdue recognition of elements, if you will, of what we see today in not only the NBA but in pro sports overall. It was a colorful league, and in many cases, it was a amazingly positive and fun-filled and adventurous experience.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the challenges of doing this film, is that the ABA was renegade, rebellious in its spirit. They played with a red, white, and blue basketball. And it was a league that was built to be fun. And that included, the way the fans were able to interact with the players. After games in Indianapolis, one of the players owned a bar. They would all go, everybody would go to the bar and hang out with the players.
Well, Neto famously had a place, right?
Yeah.
Neto's place, right? Yeah.
That's what I'm talking about. Yep. And so, the fans had, the halftime entertainment and things like that. It was a lot of fun. And it was, so that idea of sports being entertainment, I don't want to say it began in the ABA, but it blossomed in the ABA. And it was, and it's a lot of that you see in the modern game. It's such a better product if you're looking for an entertainment escape. So, people who aren't necessarily sports fans could go to an ABA game and just have some fun. So, I think there's a huge contribution. And so when they had the 50th anniversary, it was in part to celebrate all that the ABA had created and hadn't necessarily been given recognition for, as sort of pioneers, as not only in deed but also in spirit. And so they, the Dropping Dimes Foundation created a huge celebration for them here in Indianapolis, at the field house where the current Indiana Pacers NBA team plays. And the family that owns the Indiana Pacers provided the field house for free, and they made sort of championship era sort of style rings for every player who came in that talked about 50 years, and it was just a wonderful celebration. Like there was tons of autographs and people bringing in their red, white, and blue balls from days gone by, getting them autographed. It was a really great thing. But underneath that, and the reason it was tricky telling the story is that that's a really fun, feel good kind of thing. But the guys in their 70s and 80s also knew that a lot of their brothers were struggling, and they wanted some, what they would have called justice, about a pension that they thought had been promised in the legal documents when the two leagues combined. I don't think we necessarily touched on it, but in 1976, the ABA and the NBA combined. 4 ABA teams went into the NBA. the Indiana Pacers, the Denver Nuggets, San Antonio Spurs, and the New Jersey Nets. And the rest of the league folded. And so there were inches thick documents of for this expansion agreement, which is often called a merger. And within those documents, the players would often say, look, it's written in there that we were promised a pension, just like the NBA guys, and we never got it. And so whether that was a legal misunderstanding or whether that was something more, was something that our kind of hero in this story, the lawyer Scott Tarter, started looking into, and that's a big part of our film.
Yeah, and you danced around some semantics that are extremely important, right? Because the word merger, which was, and you showcase this in the film, liberally used in terms of the coverage of this thing and the portending of it and the ultimate consummation of it. But as you highlight with a number of different folks, including one of the lawyers on the NBA side, Harvey Benjamin, talking about, there's a legal, and you've also explained it too. I don't want to give away on the film, but some of this is known history, but some of the intrigue of this is not. Merger and expansion are two different sort of legal frameworks, if you will. And by labeling it officially or legally as an expansion, there's, an understanding from a legal perspective that the liability of anything that might have come before is no longer applicable because it's not a merger and an acquisition of any of those potential liabilities, such as this said pension plan, but an expansion where there is less or no, or could be more easily construed to have not any liability exposure. And in that thicket, I'm oversimplifying it maybe complexly, there is, the weeds matter here because sadly, that's where a lot of this pension understanding and effect got lost.
Yes. And so Scott Tarter is a mergers and acquisitions lawyer, M&A lawyer. And so there was no more perfect person to start looking into this. And so, he recognized it before too long that the way it was phrased as an expansion agreement really limited the rights that the players would have. And no matter what it said in there and why it was written the way it was written, which seems to say to any layperson, yeah, you get a pension. But to a lawyer, somebody who reads legalese all the time, and it didn't say that. So it's one of those things that is, from a legal point of view, if you were protecting your client, smartest thing in the world to do. From a human point of view, really disappointing.
So let's talk about the unspoken in this conversation thus far, and that is the NBA. I think it's easy for a lot of people to immediately look at the NBA as the villain in this, and frankly, I think they're right. But it's not necessarily exactly perhaps how you think the villainy plays out, because a lot of this story feels to me, and from the title on through, almost sort of a delay and obfuscation kind of approach than, I don't know, a seemingly genuine willingness to, quote unquote, do the right thing. It seems like the speak from the league, officially, and the signal sent by the league, and we see this in the story playing out as you lay it out. It often feels like it's words that ultimately don't get fulfilled, and or worse, don't contain any value whatsoever. And the frustration, if there's any word that sort of you can apply to the narrative of this film, it's that, not in a viewing perspective. It's engaging, it's enthralling, frankly. But from the participants, especially on the good guys side, it had to be just a perplexing to get little to no traction with this league that, frankly, had to be guilted into even having negotiation and conversation around it.
Yeah, it's nuanced from a lot of different perspectives. I think, okay, let's take the league's perspective, which we only somewhat know. But league is at this point worth billions and billions and billions of dollars, which means that the top lawyers in the world and the top accountants in the world and those who assess risk are going to look at something like this and say, boy, the risk is maybe only a 1% thing, but when you're worth that much money, why take it? And so from a business point of view, I think you can understand the way the league acted.
Yeah,
Now,
that said, though, fair enough, and neither of us are lawyers, but I
right.
that
So
said,
that's
this also
one
wasn't
perspective.
sure, but this also wasn't an antitrust suit per se. Although I guess the lawyers would always sort of put that into the
Always,
best pile,
the
right?
lawyers are always looking for the wild card that says, well, if you do that,
Could
then
go wrong,
somebody's going to
right.
come out of the woodwork and say this. Maybe they're right. But if you then look at a guy like Scott Tarter, like, okay, the frustration is not only he's trying to negotiate something that he thinks is just. He doesn't have a ton of leverage, and he on one side, and on the other side, he's got these former players. He became their advocate, right? They didn't have anybody else that was working for them on this. He was the guy, and so him daily, many calls a day, saying, "Hey, what's up? What's up? What's up?" and having to kind of repeat. He's generally an optimist, so he was trying to be optimistic all the way through, and that started to wear on him. And then you got the players, right? So you got some players who are doing okay financially and wanted to see this through and wanted to get some what they would feel sort of respectful treatment. And then there are other guys who were desperate, and and then you've got honestly there's a racial difference in racial perspective. The black guys who were a part of the ABA, and the ABA was almost the inverse of the NBA in terms of racial composition. So if the NBA was 80% white, 20% black, it was probably the inverse in the ABA. And honestly, the black players brought so much of the pace and the style and that we all love in basketball. And so they knew that they had changed the game in a really positive way. And yet, what did they have to show for it? And so there was one guy, and a guy named Frank Card, who was a great player. He told Dana Benbow of the Stars, and look, after one frustration after another, look, the NBA is just waiting for us to die. That was his perspective. None of these perspectives is necessarily wrong because they're all coming at it from their own self-interest. But to see them all in kind of a prism, a series of prisms, that was really interesting to me. I really think that the NBA owners or the NBA players, the current NBA players, are hard-hearted necessarily. I think they're often ignorant, frankly. These guys, and they're all worth many millions or billions of dollars, and in the owners' cases, they have bubbles around them, really fierce protective bubbles, and you understand why. Everybody wants something from them. So to try and pierce that bubble, when you can pierce that bubble, maybe you can get some change to happen. And that's kind of what we saw unfold. One of Dana's articles went national, and it got into the Twitter feed of the president of the Players Union.
That was the passing of George Carter and his
that was one of them, and then also the passing of Sam Smith.
Oh, and Sam
And
Smith. I'm sorry, I apologize.
yeah,
Yes, both of
yeah.
them. Right.
So those two guys who both unfortunately passed away kind of bookend the NBA's awareness of this issue. The league office became aware when George Carter died, and started a very slow moving negotiation with Scott Tarter. When Sam Smith died, that makes it into C.J. McCollum, the head of the Players Union's Twitter feed, and then things start moving very, very quickly.
Yeah, it was interesting when you had C.J. McCollum as an interview subject because it's interesting. Yeah, I think to your point, right? It's the current league and the risk profile and all the money. It's a super big business right now, and there's a lot to protect, so to speak. But he's a very intelligent guy. Where you get you hear directly from him. There is this, you could use the word ignorance. Maybe that's too big of a word or too charged a word. There's just a lack of knowledge.
Yeah, a little oblivious.
Of what came before. Now, in our little small, odd, nonprofit way, we've been bringing up these issues for lots of different sports and leagues and things and situations over the last 7 years in these conversations and our pursuits. Because we do think there is importance in that history, even if it's something as silly as where is the banner that should have been out there in 1977? Where is it? I mean, should it be in a box somewhere or should it be living somewhere? And why isn't it hanging somewhere? Two existential questions and life changing ones like this, right? Yeah. It's just I guess it's a statement that I think struck me in his conversation that ignorance of history can be dangerous because not only is it from whence you came, which is important in terms of heritage and how we got here and all and self-awareness and that kind of stuff, but frankly, what did come before you and the legacies that not only need to be preserved and remembered, but shall we say made whole, especially in situations maybe where, like this one, they haven't been.
Yeah. I would agree with you. And I think CJ feels that to a degree now. And, and he's a more mature player at this point, right? He's in his early 30s. And he makes the point that, guys are coming in their teens. They just have a different perspective on what they need to pay attention to. And so, a bit of maturity and seasoning, you can see how when you get to be an older player, maybe you start to recognize a little more those whose shoulders you stand upon.
Yeah, there's also a cyclical component to this, right? I mean, history does, if it doesn't repeat itself, it certainly rhymes a lot. And the NBA is obviously near the pinnacle right now of its prowess. It wasn't always that way, especially during the 1970s, which we'll talk about again in a second. International is frankly the way it has to go now. I mean, save for maybe one or two more expansion franchises, because that's the only place where growth is. And if there's another league that gets built out there that challenges the Euro League and that kind of stuff, I mean, who knows what happens to pensions and mergers and those kinds of things anew again. I mean, these things aren't necessarily unrepeatable. Although it sounds fanciful but given where the NBA is. But let's look back at the 70s for a second, because one of the fundamental questions I've always had, and this one, this angle of the story certainly, I think exacerbates it as well, is, and maybe here's the question for you: in your mind, who needed who more? Was it the ABA needing the NBA for validation and financial stability, or was it the NBA who was lacking in lots of different things, wasn't necessarily doing financially well either, and frankly was losing the culture and entertainment value game to this ABA thing despite its shaky financial status?
So are we talking about now 1976?
Yeah. Or frankly, maybe even earlier, given that the 1970 was when the original overture around a merger was supposedly.
I think in 1970, I would venture to say that the NBA needed the ABA a little more. And because the original league of the ABA was formed by their ownership to kind of, wedge their way into the NBA. They wanted to be NBA owners. The NBA didn't really let in a lot of owners, so this rival league was formed to kind of force its way.
The 1960s AFL and other leagues' 1970s style playbook to effect that. That was heady times for that kind of approach.
Yeah, and so there's a reason that they played with a red, white, and blue ball, and they were and they had a lot of black players and were very up tempo. It was different, right? They needed to differentiate themselves from the kind of stodgy NBA. So in 1970, when they originally wanted to merge, it was kind of working for the ABA owners. Now they still didn't have a national TV contract. They still didn't have some things, but you can, and from the NBA's perspective, they were starting to have to pay their players a lot more because free agency didn't exist at that point. So, if a player for an NBA team wanted to have any kind of leverage, they couldn't say, well, I'll leave you, Boston Celtics, and go to the Chicago Bulls. You couldn't just jump teams like that. So there was really no leverage. But when the ABA came along, suddenly they did have leverage. Like, I'll leave you, Boston Celtics, and just go over to the ABA. So player salaries were escalating, and the NBA owners did not like that. And so, that merger attempt went very far down the road, but it was ultimately blocked by the NBA Players Association, the NBA's Players Union, in order to preserve that ability to leverage themselves for contract negotiations. They didn't want the two leagues to combine. So that was an antitrust lawsuit that was filed by Oscar Robertson and the Players Union. He was the head of the Players Union at that point. And it stuck around for several years in the early 70s. So there was no merger that could happen. And that truly would have been a merger. And so go up to 1976. Now, the ABA has been hanging around as a popular basketball product, but it still didn't have a television contract. A lot of the franchises were really struggling financially. And so by the time they kind of limped to the end of the 1976 season, and these talks started up with the NBA, the ABA owners had almost zero leverage. And the ABA players and their union, no leverage. They didn't have any. And so they weren't even at the table. They were not invited. When these discussions happened, it was the NBA owners and the ABA owners trying to figure out how can we essentially make the ABA go away and take its best parts. So they took the 4 teams in that they wanted. They called in then the NBA Players Union, Oscar Robertson's union, and said, look, we're going to combine the leagues. And if you come along, you get rid of that antitrust argument that you had with us for several years, we will essentially give you free agency, meaning you can now start to leverage yourself against other teams in our league. That was what Oscar Robertson wanted. He got it. So now you got 3 of the 4 parties in alignment. And so then, only then, did they call the ABA Players Union and say, look, you got 1 day to figure this out. We're all going to merge or expand, whatever you wanted to call it. And if you don't sign on, every player in the ABA is going to be out of a job because the league is going to fold. And if you do sign, then we've got all these benefits for you. And here's this ton of documentation that looks like it says you have a pension. It looks like you're taken care of. You should sign this. And the poor head of the ABA Players Union, he was not a lawyer. He was a basketball player. And he was put in this situation where he had roughly 20 hours to evaluate hundreds of pages of legal documents. He didn't have a lawyer sitting next to him. He was sitting in his living room in Utah. And he didn't know what to do, and ultimately just decided to sign it, thinking it was the best course of action. And I think has felt badly about that ever since, because so many of the players wound up, in their minds, getting screwed. The stuff that he thought was promised in those documents wasn't necessarily promised.
All right, what's this? Royal Retros. All right, longtime fans of this show may remember a little site that we used to promote the heck out of called 503 Sports. Well, not only are they still around, they are now known as Royal Retros. RoyalRetros.com, the king of throwbacks. And like the name implies, the highest quality jerseys and hats and apparel and all kinds of stuff related to various teams and leagues and situations that we love to obsess about here on this show. And I'm talking about getting jerseys with your name and number on the back of them, customized to your liking for the WHA or old NHL hockey teams that may not exist anymore. Perhaps it's a Federal League team from way back or a Negro League team. Maybe you're just enamored with the various football leagues of the past, like the Arena League or the All-American Football Conference or the original UFL, United Football League. Yes, you can get all of those teams in all kinds of colors, away jerseys, home jerseys. You want to put your name on them. You want to make sure you got the official patch on the side. All of those things and more at RoyalRetros.com. And I'm not kidding, friends. You go there, you want to find that Cleveland Barons jersey to wear and show. Hey, you're maybe a Colorado Avalanche fan and you want to represent the Quebec Nordiques from where they came in the arena to show your heritage and your love and knowledge of the history of that franchise. You can do that and more. And I'm talking across football and basketball and baseball and hockey and you name it. All kinds of great stuff for you to find and buy and purchase and wear proudly from Royal Retros. That's RoyalRetros.com. And of course, we have a promo code for you. We want to save you money from all these great things. And here's that code. It's SEATS, SEATS, promo code SEATS for all of your purchases at RoyalRetros.com. Check them out. You'll be glad you did. We love them. And our friend Destin Alameda there out in Portland, Oregon, we appreciate his and their sponsorship of this show. And now, back to our conversation. So Jumbo Jim Akins was probably one of the biggest new pieces of information and contribution to the story I think that this film brings. He apparently had never talked about this publicly since then, right? How did you find him, and how did you get him to jump in with especially given the position and I guess the guilt that he felt, albeit necessarily not fully, if at all, his fault?
Yeah, I mean, he's very deep in his faith, and I think he carried it with him as sort of the part of how he evaluates himself, and so. But from the outside looking in, it wasn't fair. He shouldn't have felt that guilt. He was put in an awful position. Jim became. I learned about Jim and his feelings about this via the Dropping Dimes Foundation. When he heard that they were trying to help ABA guys, he reached out and to Scott Tarter in particular and said he wanted to help. So. He spent a lot of time. So you can imagine over the course of 40 or 50 years since the 1976 expansion, guys went their separate ways. Now a lot of, lots of people stayed in touch with each other, but there are lots of guys who just disappeared. So trying to find them so that you could try and get them some help and some benefits wasn't easy. And so Jim really took a lead role in that. He scoured databases. He called as many ABA guys as he still still had their numbers. And I think to Scott Tarter's estimation, probably half the guys they found came through Jumbo Jim. And so, he was really, really dedicated. And so when the situation, as you'll see in the film, somewhat resolves. Um, Jim, I think, felt a good sense of relief from that, but also in knowing that he had found a lot of guys who were going to get some help, and so when I called him, he was not. I wouldn't exactly say he was excited to tell his side of the story, but he did. After a good long conversation, he did agree to do so, and so we went out to Salt Lake City, where he still lives, and sat down with him, and it was a really moving interview. He's just a genuinely nice man, and so it was something to hear a smart, proud man talk in a very honest way about a moment that hurt him.
It also didn't make the antagonist that much more understandable, right? The NBA, right? Despite all its reasons and valid business perspectives to do what they did,
Mm-hmm.
from an ethical perspective and moral perspective, it after still all of this time, and what it took to get on various important radars, it just feels hollow, even as we and you luckily had the opportunity to kind of literally see the last few minutes or last couple of hours of waiting until at least some form of resolution occurs. It's hard not to look at this film maybe even halfway through and say, WTF, NBA. Like, right? I mean,
yeah.
So before we get to sort of that semi-resolution, why do you think, from your perspective, the NBA drags current and dragged past tense its feet so long, even in the awareness and social media in the last couple of years, when it was becoming more and more obvious to more and more people?
It's a great question. I'm not sure I ever got a fully satisfactory answer, but I can tell you that I think the guy whose perspective I would probably value most in trying to answer that is Scott Tarter, right? So he was in the negotiations with them, hearing what they were saying or not saying when in long Zoom meetings, and I think it was, from his perspective, just not enough of a priority, right? The urgency and understanding that human lives were at stake. Guys not getting benefits at this stage in their life could cost them their lives. And I don't think they saw that or heard that to the degree that Tarter was trying to make them aware. I think that urgency, it clearly just it wasn't high enough on the radar or to spur urgent action. The only time it did is when one of Dana's articles, which had a particularly strong image, a photo that kind of got to the heart of the urgency.
Yeah.
That's the thing that pierced the bubble of CJ, and he, and a lot of people on social media, on Reddit and Twitter. That story kind of blew up because of that photo, and then when that happened, things started moving a lot more quickly.
Well, as I said earlier, you were lucky enough, I guess, from a time perspective, to have the ability to kind of be in the room, so to speak, albeit not in the actual room, but in a room distant from the actual room. I don't want to give away too much, but in July of 2022, gosh, it's almost 2.5 years ago now.
Yeah.
A mostly happy event occurred. But interestingly, and I didn't know this part of it, and maybe you can sort of elaborate for our audience, not a full resolution of this issue. But first things first, even took extra time, if you will, that evening to get some kind of resolution, further dragging a microcosm of the story.
Yeah, yeah. The title of the film, The Waiting Game, is applicable in many different senses, and scene by scene, you just kind of see it happening. And so the night that the NBA Board of Governors had on its agenda a motion to create a fund, not a pension, but a fund to help struggling ABA guys. That night, they here in Indianapolis, the guys, Scott Tarter, John Abrams, and a board member, Ted Green, they were really the only three people of Dropping Dimes. They got together in a very barren conference room here and just were waiting to hear, had this come up in the meeting, had it been approved. They expected it to be approved, but they weren't sure. And boy, tick tock, it just kept going. What they expected to happen at a particular time didn't. And they went through an agonizing wait until it did finally come up on the agenda. It was passed, and so it was a very meaningful moment for those guys, and obviously much more meaningful for the players who would get the benefits. But they had put in so much work on this, the guys from Dropping Dimes, that it was very powerful. And then some of the details started to trickle in, and what they had thought was in the agreement, it wasn't all there. And so there were some guys that were left out. And it's a nuance, but as it so happened that we had wound up profiling a couple of guys who needed help, and a couple of them were ones that were left out. So even though they had played a number of years in the ABA, the justification was because they had played a few years also in the NBA and qualified for the minimum NBA pension, that their ABA years were not going to get them any of these benefit payments.
Which is ironic, because you spent a lot of time highlighting the page that Scott Tarter obsesses over and tries to divine, different interpretations to better understand sort of the what ultimately is in those words and how they're arranged. Because in that original understanding, right, the ABA Players Association and the league and everybody in the environment thought that ABA, those years would be quote unquote credit, if you will, into as equal to as if they had played, literally specifically says, as in the NBA. And here at the end of this road, or partially the end of the road, it's actually still not the case, where it's actually the antithesis of that, where your credit, if you had somehow wound up in the NBA and gotten under that pension plan, you got no credit for those ABA years, which seems further devious.
It's not illegal. I mean, because look, these guys,
a lot of this is not illegal, it seems, but that doesn't make it right.
Right. So the bucket of money was called recognition payments. It was very clearly not called a pension. So anything that would tie back to those documents, there was no pension coming the way of the ABA guys. But these recognition payments, as Darnell Hill film, it's, to not get any of the recognition payments, because he was one of the guys that played for a few years in the NBA. And so,
because Darnell Hillman was a hell of a player and had a future ahead of him still. Some did too, right?
Yeah, no. So he he said, look, this is a slap in the face. That's what it feels like. They're happy that the ABA guys who didn't go into the NBA got some recognition payments. Everybody's happy for them, but to carve out against these guys, there's 24 guys. Some of them as wildly successful as Julius Erving, who is doing great, but he too feels slighted. He's in the film and he feels slighted by this. And then other guys, we look at a guy named Jimmy Jones, who was a 6-time All-Star, and he could have used. He's driving an Uber today. He could use credit for his 7 years in the ABA, and he didn't get any. So,
and it's not like that credit, by the way, would necessarily balloon this thing to
no,
especially for 24 guys, right?
Yeah, no, you're talking of the people who really didn't get taken care of to the degree that Dropping Dimes had hoped that they would were these 24 guys, and then widows. Widows. So if you were one of the players who is now getting a benefit payment, if you die, your family will not keep getting those benefits. The benefit's over, and so I think the goal, the work still to be done, largely, is to try and find a way to close that gap. To say, look, let's help these 24 guys, let's help widows, and as much as anything, a statement from the NBA and the Players Association about how much respect they owe the ABA guys. I think that, and I think Scott would agree with me if he were here, that statement of respect would go maybe further than the money, because that's really what these guys feel is missing.
All right, I want to get to the film and the promotion of it and all that kind of stuff in a second. But here's my last question for you on the meat of our conversation. What happens now? What do you think occurs now? Is essentially the story over, or do you think there's a potential for, I don't know, further resolution or at least recognition beyond where July 2022 left us with those 24 guys?
I would love it if the film and the work of Dropping Dimes is able to right what seems to me to still be a wrong. These 24 guys that are left out, and just a little bit of help for families who are going to be struggling. If an ABA player who's getting a benefit dies. So that won't take a lot of money. Certainly not by NBA standards. The fine pool every year for the NBA for swearing at refs or whatever causes somebody to get a $25,000 or $50,000 fine. That pool is like $100 million a year. It's the scale of money is just extraordinary, and a portion of that is supposed to be dedicated to charitable giving. So even if you just looked at that, this is very solvable. Not to mention, sort of, if the players union, just as they didn't recognize that there was an issue before, Dana's article got them to take action, maybe they didn't recognize that the job wasn't fully done. And if they see the film and could say, oh gosh, we could come up with that, $3, $4, $5, $6 million, whatever it is, we could come up with that. We'll take care of that. It could get fixed, but something's got to break through. Maybe it'll be this film. Do I think anybody's going to proactively take a look at it without, a Dropping Dimes or a Dana Benbow or maybe this film kind of leading the way? No, I don't. I think people think it's done.
Well, I'll go one step further. I mean, there's even there's even a less expensive way, so to speak, to at least cover the recognition part. But I'm not saying you should stop there either, right? The money is
Mhm.
obviously extremely important. It's part of the whole story. But these are 24 guys, right? Who went into the absorption in the NBA. There are ways, most of those teams, and I have to go look at the records, right? But most of those teams, I don't think any of those teams died. They probably some of them might have moved since the NBA happened. You could at least figure out a way to recognize these guys in the ultimate places that their NBA play wound up going franchise-wise, right? So if somebody played for Kansas City Kings and, they could do something under the Sacramento banner, so to speak, and at least give, and that, in addition to the money situation, could be a bit of the youngins education process,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Where, what I mean? So, it's something that doesn't take anything, right? That's a little PR planning, right?
Exactly. No, you're right. There's a huge opportunity for some great public relations and merchandise sales. Honestly,
Sure, and
because
it's a way to raise some funds.
yeah, there's all sorts of things that somebody of the right mindset could dream up. Yeah, I don't know whether it'll happen or not. There's been a lot of time and opportunity to do so, and it hasn't happened yet. So I'm not sure what it would take to change that. But one of the things we're trying to do, and we're talking about the distribution of the film. One of the things we're trying to do is to take the film to ABA cities. So I'm based in Indianapolis, so we've shown it here several times, and the ABA fandom comes out of the woodwork. They love coming out and celebrating the guys, and we have as many local ABA players come as possible. We have them stand up; they've gotten standing ovations. It's been great for them. Really cool to see them get that moment. And we're going to Louisville in early March, and going to do the same thing there for their Kentucky Colonels, and hope to do it in Denver and in San Antonio and in Utah and Salt Lake City, all the ABA cities, because the ABA franchise is really there was a love affair with those teams from their local communities, and so we want to try and get as many of those players to stand up, at least in their local communities, and get a minute of recognition.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we talk a lot about different leagues and different sports and stuff, and their willingness or lack of interest, depending on the situation, of remembering some of these teams in the past. And you almost can. It's a weird dichotomy. Like Major League Soccer, for example, has been very, very tenuous in terms of its embrace of teams in the old NASL that now actually are labeled for the teams in Vancouver and Portland and San Jose and Seattle that used to be the names of the teams in the NASL. They didn't want that. They didn't want to be associated with that failure that occurred in the 70s and 80s. Hardly a failure. It's upon which the pro game is built on, all that kind of stuff, right? So, but here's the similar situation, right? That clearly there are four legacy teams that came out of the ABA and went on to NBA greatness and are still around. But there's a lot of people don't want to necessarily remember the Anaheim Amigos, right? Or the Chaparrals in Dallas before the Mavericks discovered the NBA. But yet you got the Heat, right, doing occasional once a year, hot pants memorial to the Miami Floridians, which were arguably one of the craziest and weakest franchises in the entire league's history. But are great for marketing, right? So
yeah,
it's just it can be very disingenuous at times, and yet there's so much fertile ground and I don't know, historical logic. I mean, why sweep all that stuff under the rug when you can embrace it? I mean, for good, for bad, right? Sure, the NBA and all its, multi-billion-dollar, stance right now, right? They don't want to remember, the the ABA and the St. Louis Spirits story and that buyout that made the Silnas rich for doing really nothing. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that they don't necessarily want to risk, so to speak, but I don't know. It's part of the history, and you can only sugarcoat it and whitewash it so much. And as long as guys who gave their best years in one of the tributaries to this thing and still aren't fully made whole, it's just it boggles the mind, and it also strains logic sometimes when some things, not everything, but some things could be done relatively straightforward and inexpensively to at least give them some benefit on the recognition part, at least.
And importantly, it can be done quickly.
Totally agree.
These guys are not getting any younger, and so guys are going quickly, and so the more recognition that can happen faster, the better.
All right, tell us where, tell me how this film is getting out there. You're hinting at taking it to ABA cities and presenting it and stuff, but I got to think you want some other distribution mechanisms, be it streaming or more widely available or accessible too, right? And now I guess we get into the point of independent filmmaking and documentaries at that, and how difficult it is today to get stuff out there.
It is. There are a lot of good films that don't find traction, and so we're trying to sort of do an all of the above effort. It's very grassroots. If you don't have a studio behind you, you're going to have to find your way that way. So doing community screenings, very, very important, right? And so we're targeting ABA cities, but we'll take the film anywhere where we can do that. And we have a website. It's thewaitinggamemovie.com, where you can sign up for a community screening if you think that you've got a theater and a little bit of support that can help us get it there. We'll do it. And then we have an agent out repping it to streamers, and it will find a home somewhere. I think you and others have believe it's a good film, a worthy film, and I think we've heard that enough now that there's an audience for this, and so, but that game takes a long time. There's a lot of pitching. There's a lot of negotiating. It takes a long time. And so we don't want this to just sit while that's happening. My point earlier, these ABA guys aren't getting any younger. So we need to get this story out there any way we can. And so that's what we're doing. You can also watch the film on the website. So there's a link where you can watch it there. It's $10. And, I hope people do. It'll help us.
And you never know who listens to this show. Actually, I do sometimes. So they come out of the woodwork. Sometimes they want to remain anonymous and whatever. But as whatever little we can do to sort of get that out further, for sure. I wonder, if the NBA could ever, bring its media machine into the mix, but I doubt it, right? Because it doesn't necessarily make them look great. But there's got to be plenty of other basketball venues and sports venues and that kind of stuff. So. I appreciate you taking the time to give us some background on this. It is, I watched it twice, last night and about 2 hours ago in prep, and it was gripping, frankly. It even though I kind of knew where the story was headed, some of the specifics and the granularities of it were absolutely revelations to me. And I think, frankly, it's something that every fan of basketball should watch, because it gives you a real honest sense of what this time in the 70s was all about between these two leagues. Understanding what a quote unquote expansion was versus a quote unquote merger, and the implications of those two words in human form, some of whom never got the benefit of the correction of those issues back then. So in my mind, this puts a spotlight on a story that I think people kind of gauzily paper over because it's a fun and crazy story about a league that was so vibrant and colorful and just full of verve. I think people kind of, I don't know, maybe aided and abetted by the NBA, just want to make it sort of I don't know, an interesting point in the story that just was a fun diversion. And it was certainly a whole lot more than that. It was actually more important than that too.
Yeah, it's very important. It's the development of it was a key moment in the development of entertainment in sports, any sport, and basketball has taken full advantage of that as a sport, and really leveraged it and made a tremendous business out of it. Great, everybody can respect that. It's a matter of now going back and just sort of finding the core humanity of the guys who did that, the factory workers, and take care of them. Make them feel great in their last years. That's not so hard to do.
All right, our thanks to Michael. The movie is an absolute must-see. It is called The Waiting Game. They changed basketball. Will they be given their due? It is directed, written, and produced by our guest this week, Michael Husain. And it is coming to Louisville. So if you're in the Louisville area on March 6th, you can see a screening of this film there at the, I guess it's the AAA baseball stadium / train station. They're conjoined there. And they're going to have a nice sort of festive area there to screen the movie with a whole bunch of ABA players and other fans and stuff of the old Kentucky Colonels, of course. That's why Louisville is such a great ABA city, and perhaps even an NBA city someday, knock on wood. You can find out more information as to about where specifically, how to get tickets and all that kind of stuff, as well as the opportunity to actually watch the film directly on your little web browser there at thewaitinggamemovie.com. That's thewaitinggamemovie.com. All that you want to find out about the film, the background, and it's got a lot of great folks in it. Bob Costas and Dr. J are both in it. Dan Issel, former guest on this show. Bob Nedelecki, another guest on this show. And it's just chock-full. Spencer Hayward and Darnell Hillman and Ralph Simpson. Some of these Chuck Williams. Some of these great players who are part of this amazing story known as the ABA. Jimmy Jones is in this too. There's a whole bunch of other folks that are just. You will learn a lot. You will be entertained, and you will be, I think, infuriated with the NBA still, despite what they have done finally, albeit not completely, as part of this story. Again, thewaitinggamemovie.com. Check it out. I think it's like $10 to watch the film, and it's a small price to pay until and when we get this into larger streaming environments, and hopefully someday soon we will get help us see that movie out there in a grander fashion in the various streaming services out there. You can also check out, I would strongly encourage you to check out the Dropping Dimes Foundation. And that website there is droppingdimes.org. Droppingdimes.org. And that is the charitable organization that you heard discussed, that Scott Tarter and others are part of. And you can donate to the cause there. In the interim, while the NBA continues to make good on its promise and hopefully follows through on the last bits of it, you can help donate and make an ABA player's life that much better by donating to that cause at, again, droppingdimes.org. While you're online, go to our website at Good Seats Still Available. You can see all of our previous episodes there, including all of our old ABA episodes with people like the late Dennis Murphy, Dan Issel, Bob Nedelecki, and the late Robin Miller, Pat Boone, even his Oakland Oaks story from way back when. Lots of other ABA adjacent stuff there too. among other sports and leagues and teams that people have, for whatever reasons, forgotten. That's what we obsess about here on this show. Follow us on the socials. We're probably most active on the Blue Sky. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find us less active, but fairly active on the X thing. That's at Good Seats Still. All the other socials, you find us at Good Seats Still Available. Those are a little more irregular. I would say YouTube, we're there every week. We have a YouTube version of the podcast. So if you want to watch it or stream it there, you can do that. But of course, the best way to get the show is to find and follow us wherever you get podcasts. Make sure that you're subscribed and ready to go so that the second that we drop an episode, you will be getting it into your earbuds or your player or something like that. And that's the best way to do so. Please do that. Give us a rating and review of nicety, if you will, to 5 stars or whatever. We'd appreciate that. And if you'd like to send us some email, you can do that too. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. We also want to say hello and thank you to Jerry Payne, of course. His audio excellence shining bright again this week. We appreciate that. And thank you again for listening. Great episode this week. Many more to come. Hope you enjoyed it. And if you enjoyed the show, send us a note or tell a friend and get them to subscribe and listen as well. We appreciate that. Take care of yourselves. And until next week, ta-ta.